Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, a record number of Utah voters turn out on Super Tuesday and make their mark on the direction of the presidential election. The legislative session enters its final days as lawmakers hustle to pass bills. And as the country reacts to the coronavirus, state leaders lay out their plan to handle the potential health crisis. Good evening and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Jasen Lee, journalist with the Deseret News, Kate Bradshaw, Director of Government Affairs at Holland and Hart and Bountiful City Councilwoman, and Max Roth, anchor with Fox 13 News. So glad to have you all with us tonight. I want to jump right into the great event of this week, Super Tuesday. The very first time Utah has ever participated in Super Tuesday as a primary like this for the presidential race. Max, was this successful? Rate how this thing is in terms of how Utah performed in this.
Well, in terms of, for Utah, I think there's no question that it was successful. There was good voter turnout. Votes are still trickling in, but we're getting upwards of 35% participation, which is really big for a primary. We had, from my industry's point of view, there was a lot of money spent on advertising for Super Tuesday in Utah, although the lion's share of that came from Mike Bloomberg. So
you're all very sad about that one.
That he dropped out of the race. Yeah. I don't think he was going to spend a lot more on Utah advertising anyway after Super Tuesday. But no, I think it was a big deal. And Utah, most importantly, Utah got attention from candidates. And that is really key. That's why Patrice Arendt's bill to put Utah on the Super Tuesday calendar was put in place in the first place, and it worked.
Mm-hmm. Kate, I want to ask about a couple of these voter turnout issues because it was amazing. 35% is what it looks like we're going to get of turnout of registered voters, 30%, so the active versus the normal registered voters. But I want to talk about the Democratic Party in particular. So the Democrats have an open primary, and so these are the numbers people may not know. 209,000 registered Democrats in the state of Utah, and 194,000 people cast a ballot for the Democratic Party.
It is interesting. In Utah, we actually have a significant number of voters that are registered as unaffiliated voters. So they haven't selected a party. And because the Democrats have left their primaries open to unaffiliated voters, you saw a lot of people who were unaffiliated who were kind of interested in wanted to cross over and have a say in whittling down that list of candidates on the Democratic side. So I think that's probably where you saw that uptick of numbers. There's obviously been a whole year plus worth of debates and things like that on the Democratic side. So there's a lot of interest there, I think, among Utahns nationally to be able to be part of the Super Tuesday, which we've never done before.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how many people went to that side, but I want to get to the Republican side for just a minute as well. Donald Trump, Jason, 88% of the vote.
Not surprising, almost 9 out of 10, and you could understand that he is a sitting president, and so typically that would be the kind of support. What I'm a bit surprised by is just over about 55% of Utahns admit to supporting the president, and what's kind of confusing to me is in a state where generally speaking, morality, integrity, honesty are values that are held very closely and espoused by most people, certainly in our political arena. But the president, objectively speaking, embodies none of those things. And I'm always a bit kind of perturbed that he even has a higher approval rating than our own congressional delegation, because people, for reasons that are a bit confusing to me, they seem to support him one way or the other.
Well, the Republicans, it was 46% turnout for Republicans. So given all the stuff right there, kind of explain why maybe Republicans stayed so engaged in this Super Tuesday, because maybe one might think that they wouldn't have.
Well, but again, this is the presidential election, and I think, and particularly in America in general, this is the time when they feel most empowered to choose the person who's going to run the country, who most called the most powerful politician in the world. And this is an opportunity to be involved in that. So even though it's a primary, and even though he was going to win handily anyway, it gives people the excitement to look forward to coming to November. We're only a few months away from that. And now we're kind of getting down to the nitty-gritty, to the point where we're really going to begin to have, they've whittled down the Democratic candidates to about, now 2, essentially. This is going to be the time when we really find out who it is that's going to be the next president of the United States.
If I could, it will be a surprise to nobody that I've been geeking out all week on numbers, and I've been looking through the numbers of votes in Utah, and when we look at the voter turnout, actually, when you look at the Republican turnout, the last time we had a presidential primary in Utah was 2008. Mitt Romney and John McCain were both in it at that point. And Republican turnout was higher then than it was this last time around. Now, more Republicans voted this time around, but as compared to the population increase, once you take that into effect and the population of registered voters, actually Republican turnout was down. It's the Democrats that fueled that uptick, that record number of votes for presidential primary. So Democratic voting increased by more than 40%. From 2008 to 2020, and Republican voting increased by just around 7%. And so, while registered voters increased by 12%. So Republicans were not excited to really participate in this election quite so much.
Very interesting. Let's talk about some of the after effects of the mail-in ballots, Kate, because that was what we're hearing from a lot of people. So let's say this great analysis that Max just gave on the numbers there. So there are a lot of Utahns that got their ballot for the Democratic Party, and they sent it in pretty early, only to find on the night of. Now so many of those candidates remained.
Yes, I've been a fan of the mail-in balloting. It's increased our voter turnout. It's made things a lot easier for people.
And you're in Davis County, and Davis County does better than almost any other county that way.
Yeah, that's correct. And so when I received my ballot, because it's one of those things where you don't want to lose it on your desk with all the papers, I did immediately fill it out and put it back in the mail. Now, I will confess, mine was a Republican ballot, so perhaps my choices were a little bit different. But as candidates dropped out of the race, the closer you got to our Super Tuesday, it did really change people's choices. If you had mailed yours in like I did right away, and then your choice decided to withdraw from the race, how did you feel about that?
One of my friends approached me and said, my son put his ballot in for Pete Buttigieg, and he's wondering if he can change that now because Pete pulled out on Sunday. And so, those questions came up.
Yeah, we have this ranked choice voting test pilot that has taken place in some cities. They did it in the municipal races last year. And I think this has really kind of brought that discussion back up to a different level to say, should we do this as a state? Because it's likely that in future election cycles we'll have a similar phenomenon on one side or the other of the political spectrum where you have multiple candidates. Someone might drop out, and you want to feel like your vote counted, like it mattered. And for some people, they might feel like it didn't this year because their preferred candidate dropped out after they'd already mailed in.
Yeah, Jason, that has been quite the topic of conversation, whether or not that should happen. Well, really, this race for number 2 becomes important a little bit, just in case one of these, your number 1 drops out, which several of them did.
I appreciate what she's saying. If you were to have ranked ballots, because especially in primaries, this is obviously the time when it would count, to be able to at least then have kind of a fallback position that someone you would support. Then again, you are still engaged in the democratic process, which is what Kate was talking about. To then have the situation we have now, where essentially your vote didn't count. That would be disappointing to me as well. Now, as it turns out, the candidate I happen to vote for was still in the race, but if I were the person who might have voted for Mayor Pete or for Amy Klobuchar, that would have been quite disappointing.
A couple of things. Nevada, in their caucuses this year, 2 weeks ago, did use a form of ranked choice voting, so that people who couldn't make it to their caucus, they got to turn in ballots and they ranked their candidates. So that in a caucus, we don't need to go into all those things, but if their candidate wasn't viable, then the person in charge of that caucus room would just move them down to their next choice or their next choice until one of their candidates was viable. And it seemed to work there. Another thing, though, that I think is important to note here is that this is a wonderful argument for for procrastination, which is one of my great strengths in life. And, just put it off until the end, and then you'll know what the landscape is.
That may be what happens now. From now on.
That's absolutely right.
Well, it does raise the question. As we've gone to mail-in balloting, we've reduced the number of polling places because we've given you a longer window and we've mailed them directly to you. If you procrastinate, then you can have the problem you had in California with the long lines in LA, where can people, working people, spend 2 hours, 3 hours in line waiting to vote. It does seem to me to say, let's further investigate this ranked choice option.
But I want to bring up something. This is not contradicting your point at all. You mentioned the fewer polling locations, and I don't want to finish this conversation without mentioning that Weber County tried something this year where they had one polling location in the entire county, and it was at Union Station downtown. Last time around, they had 6 in each of the public libraries. They're trying to say, hey, you know what? We have mail-in voting, so not that many people are doing this, and it's not efficient. It's not logistically sensible to have all these places. But the ACLU sent observers to those county libraries, and they counted at least 200 people who showed up to vote at their county library, and there was no voting there. And I would just say that when it comes to voting, the job of an elections official is not to make it easy for the elections official. It's to make it easy for the voter.
Very good point.
Before we leave this one a little bit, I just think we should just take a moment on the fact that Bernie Sanders won big in the state of Utah. 34%, 35% is what he got. It looks like as of our counting here. That's a big one. Does this surprise you at all, Jason?
It absolutely did, honestly. Because I always feel like people here are a bit more conservative, and Bernie's, as far left as you could possibly go. However, maybe it does show that we have not been paying attention, and that there's this bigger push for some of the at least campaign ideas that he has, that people are beginning to resonate with people, and they want that as an option for them to vote.
He has huge rallies, right, Kate? When he came, he in our caucus 2016, I think it was 79% of the vote in those caucuses. Utah's been consistently with him.
It's an interesting phenomenon, and he does drive big crowds, almost like what you see with President Trump and his rallies. They both drive really big crowds. It's often been described that because Utah is a conservative state, because we're often described as a one-party state, there is some thought that maybe that does free up those that feel like they're in the minority party position here, that they can go to the farther spectrum of their own party, because they feel like it's so important to provide that contrast. And so instead of providing a contrast closer in the moderate or centrist point of view, they're picking a candidate on the far side to just show how much they reject where the majority is. And so that might be part of the phenomenon you see with a primary vote for Bernie. And it'll be interesting to see if Utahns on the Democratic side maybe start to move in future polls.
And and I think that Sanders does very well in the West. He, when you look at that map, as you go through the East and the Southeast and the Midwest, Biden really cleaned up, and then even in Texas, Biden did well. But as you got to the Western states, Bernie Sanders won Colorado, Utah, and California.
And he does particularly well with the younger voters.
Part of that, to that point, right? So many people here are young. So many people here enjoy outdoors. So issues like public lands, issues like freedom to be able to move and do the kind of things that you enjoy. Climate change, certainly climate change in this valley. And then the idea that you are looking for someone who will champion those things for you going forward. And as a young person, those would be the things that, again, resonate most closely to you. So Bernie would be perfect for them. In some way, he's kind of a pretty good idea of what the West is. These are people who want to do more for themselves. They want to have open space. They want to have a way to enjoy all of this. And Bernie is trying to tell them, I want to give you an opportunity to do all of that. And so I think that's why they kind of gravitate toward what his message is.
And in the caucuses 4 years ago, Bernie Sanders just really cleaned up, really clobbered Hillary Clinton in Utah. He got about half of that this time around in terms of percentage, about the same number of votes, really. And so it could be those same voters, but a whole lot more people voted with the mail-in ballots, a primary rather than a caucus.
I want to spend a second on how people are feeling about kind of their elected officials for a moment as we start getting into some of the big events that are happening around the rest of the country. So a poll we just released, the Hinckley Institute with the Deseret News, had a pretty high approval rating for President Trump, 55%, which is one of the highest we've seen. Turns out higher than all of our congressional delegation in terms of that. And it's kind of linked to this one question we asked with it. Do Utahns feel like they are better off today than they were 3 years ago? Just kind of get a sense of how people are. 65% of Utahns, Kate, I want to see what you think about it. 65% of Utahns said yes, they're better off. 28% overall, 65% said yes, 6% said no overall. But what's interesting is 77% of Republicans, you might expect that, said they're better off. But 54% of Democrats also said better off.
Well, it's hard to argue with what's been happening with our economy the last several years. Until very recently with the coronavirus, the stock market has been on this tremendous run. Unemployment nationally, incredibly low. In Utah, even lower. We've had functional full employment for over a year. The economy's doing well, and often when the economy is doing well and consistently doing well, people feel like that is a reflection of the person in the top job. Fair or not, that's kind of where people assign, that it's the top job that is the result of those good economic trends we're seeing.
Yeah. It's always been the economy, right? The idea is if the economy does well, then the president does well. And like you say, whether it's to his credit or not, because in all honesty, the people in that job, they have other people working for them to help those mechanisms. And I think people, they want to know, is their 401k doing well?
A couple of things. Deep red Utah, Republican president, economy is soaring. 55%, not that big a number, really. I mean, you think about if it were Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush in there, imagine what that number would be. And the second thing is, imagine if you took that poll today. And I think that people are really worried about coronavirus, and there's some real serious concerns about how the national government's handling it.
Be interesting to see how this plays with these Democratic candidates as well, if they can reclaim. If that argument is true, it'd be very interesting to watch. Let's turn to what's happening with our local legislature. We only have a week left. We're all very sad about that. A week from yesterday is when it ends. I want to talk about some of the interesting efforts on let's call it tax reform, right? Because they repealed the tax reform. Kate, wanted to hear you because you're in the trenches on this one, right? We're still talking about some potential efforts. Let's talk about what might be coming and how they're really trying to rectify this. Our legislature trying to rectify this balance of pretty good amount of money in the education fund, not so much in the general fund.
Yeah. So, to take the viewers back just a little bit, in 2019, we started on this tax reform effort. The legislature introduced a bill fairly late. It didn't quite have legs. There was a little outcry about it. So we launched into a 2019 summer of tax reform, culminating in a special session with a tax reform bill. It had a lot of moving parts. It was fairly complicated, and voters weren't understanding all those moving parts. And so there, after the legislature passed in a special session, there was a signature gathering effort. It looked like it would be successful. So really, in the opening days of the session, the legislature pulls that back and says, okay, do-over. And so for the next several weeks, as we've done our legislative session, the legislature has had discussions. There's been several different bills that are introduced that are portions of what was in the tax reform package. None of them have made it tremendously far, in part because there's been a lot of leadership discussion about what to do. Obviously voters spoke fairly convincingly with their signature gathering efforts on sales tax on food. So now we're getting to the waning days. It seems like people are starting to coalesce maybe around doing something, but you've also got this overriding, what do we do if the coronavirus impacts our economy and our output here in Utah? So you're still hearing some interesting things about maybe we want to address this constitutional earmark question we have, where we have tremendous amount of money in our education fund. Almost $900 million.
Yeah, a lot.
And then not very much in our general fund. And so it's really impacting some of the decisions of what can be funded and what can be done this year at the state capitol.
Let's talk about this resolution, Max, if you mind describing this a little bit, because it would take a change to our Constitution to expand from this education, maybe what the definition of education is. The language in this resolution is funds could be spent to support children and to support individuals with a disability. What does that mean?
So essentially, the way Utah's funds are, Utah's revenue is structured, is that you take in money from sales tax, which has traditionally been a huge pot of money, but has consistently declined in recent years with internet purchasing, that sort of thing, and we're a service economy now as well. And so that's declining, and that funded most of the things we think about as government, except education. Education funded entirely through income tax, and income tax was earmarked, as you said, simply for education. Every dollar you spend on income tax goes to schools. And so if you want to use that income tax for something else, you have to change the state constitution. Now, I would say, though, okay, $900 million in the income tax thing, where are we still in spending per pupil? 50th. 51st if you include District of Columbia. We're not catching up with 49 anytime soon. So sure, it's you can say that there's all that money, but I think the legislature's gotten itself into trouble time and time again with propositions and with these tax issues in thinking that the real problem is that we understand and voters don't. We understand and the people don't. And if they understood what we understand, then everything would be good. Maybe listen to what the people are saying. Maybe there's something that they do understand and craft policy around that.
That arrogance is what got them in trouble with this last effort to overturn the tax reform. If lawmakers have to realize that we as voters and just everybody watching is that they do pay attention, and particularly when it comes to their money. And so rather than consider themselves, in the know and the rest of us kind of outside of that, they should be more respectful of the wishes of the people that put them in office.
Talking about the legislatures trying to get to some of those big ticket items. Okay, so what is inside of those buckets of children and individuals with disabilities? Because that, if you open up the education fund to those, maybe we should dig into that a little bit. What that means, what programs come into that?
Yeah. So if this constitutional amendment were to pass and you were to expand this definition, which would also take a vote of the people in November. You could bring in the Children's Health Insurance Program, because that would be for kids. So in addition to your traditional K through 12 education, the Children's Health Insurance Program. So this is a large program, and healthcare costs, of course, continue to rise there. And then for people with disabilities, that would also bring in the state Medicaid funds potentially, which is public education and Medicaid have always vied for the 1-2 spot in our state budget. So you could shift the estimates. The early estimates are almost $600 million with this shift.
Does that fix the imbalance our legislature's been talking about? If more of the education fund is able to offload some of the general fund expenses? I
think they believe it does, which is why they've proposed that specific expansion of for children, for people with disabilities. The question would be, I think, given that these two kind of healthcare areas they've identified expanding to are areas that, especially in hard economic times, can balloon significantly. And so would you then put these two biggest areas of our state budget together, kind of sharing our income tax, and then leave a whole bunch of smaller things in sales tax? And it's yet to be determined. Every state does these earmarks differently. They fund education in different ways. We're the only one that does it this way. Perhaps it's not working for us because, as Max pointed out, we continue to be last in student funding. And it's left us with these interesting budget challenges. But would this idea be better? Okay, I don't think we know yet.
Go ahead, and then I got
real question. So if what you say is true, that we're considering we have to use our income taxes to pay for all of these things, why would they then be considering potentially reducing the income tax, the rate of income tax.
The interesting thing is that, there's been this poll recently that came out that said that voters want their taxes reduced. I mean, who loves paying taxes? No one loves paying taxes. So you want a tax cut, and for most people that means an income tax cut. But for our state, that income tax comes out of funds for education. Right. So this is one of those where it is kind of complicated, and sometimes I think when you're doing a short polling question, that might not be fully explained to the person taking it, and they may not understand these nuances of Utah's income tax compared to, say, federal income tax and the way that we've especially put them into these different budget accounts.
Okay. A connected issue, but it's underlying a lot of the discussions in our legislature, is how they're going to handle economic impacts of coronavirus. As we've already, has been a theme here, even just a little bit in all that we've been talking about today. Max, talk about what's happening as our state. I know you've been covering it.
Yeah.
All right. What's the state approach? Where are we on this?
Well, the governor came out very seriously from the start with his monthly news conference in this same studio, actually, and in taking this very seriously. And then just this week they held a public news conference to introduce their task force led by the Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox, and they had the epidemiologist from the State Department of Health, and suggesting that they're on top of it. And quite honestly, as we look at the conflicting messages at the national level, where the doctors at the CDC are saying one thing, and then the president says, well, we only have 15 cases, and that's going to be down to almost zero, soon. And we know right now that was a ridiculous statement. And our governor was never communicating in that way from the start, taking it seriously. So I think that we can trust that they're trying to do their best. I hope that nationally we can see the same thing happening.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jason. The politics of this one. It's interesting how that becomes part of it, even as Max was talking.
It's very difficult because you can only do so much, and in policy you try to create an opportunity to be able to help your citizenry as much as possible. But then it's also incumbent upon us as citizens to do what we can to monitor ourselves, monitor the health of people around us, and do the best we can to prevent the spread as much as we can.
Mm-hmm. Kate, the legislature's creating some rainy day funds to take care of this.
They are. The legislature is talking about setting aside $16.5 million for coronavirus impacts. They're also proposing setting aside almost $100 million for the education budget in case our economy slows down as a result of this. The money they're setting aside for coronavirus impacts is I'm told, mostly going to be for epidemiologists so that we can do quick testing. And it's interesting that, already at the state capitol, there's signs up saying we don't shake hands anymore. You can do the funky chicken or finger guns. So it's having an impact. Everyone is very careful. Everyone, there's hand sanitizers everywhere, but those funds are being set aside now just in case.
It's got to be the last comment. Watching this so closely, thank you for your insights tonight. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Jason.
And thank you for watching the Hinckley Report. This show is also available as a podcast on pbsutah.org/Hinckley Report or wherever you get your podcasts. We appreciate being with us. We'll see you next week.